Q&A. Now, if you haven't come across myself before, my name is Rowan Smith. I'm the founder of Summit Strength, and I specialize in helping hikers get fit, strong, and resilient for their hiking adventures. Essentially, what we are doing today is we are doing a live Q&A around training for hiking. So if you have any questions you want answered around training for your hiking adventures, physical preparation, or anything like that, feel free just to throw the answers in the chat, and I'm more than happy to help. Now, in between all of that, I have a couple of questions which I've been sent prior to this, which I'm going to be covering and I'm going to be sort of working through. And on top of that, in between questions, and once that's all over, I will be going through some open course creation, where essentially I'll be talking through a little bit about giving you an inside look into me putting together a new course for hikers, which is all about breathing training for hiking. And we're going into that. Now, if I've done everything right, hopefully today I'll be streaming to both YouTube and also Facebook today. So fingers crossed it's all coming through okay, but we will see how we go. Just bear with. So yeah, with all that being said, anyone who is watching live, if you do have any questions you'd like me to cover, feel free to just pop them into the chat, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. I'm more than happy to help. In the meantime, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to start on our first question and we'll get into it all. So we're going to be talking about reviewing an unsuccessful hike. Now, this is a situation a lot of hikers will run into. You're training for an adventure, you're going out on training hikes, everything's going well. Then all of a sudden you step out on a hike and things just don't go well. Not much fun, very, very common. And we're going to be talking through a few ideas around how you can figure this out and get on top of it. Now, this question was inspired by basically a question I had directly from someone. They said, hey, I've been training for a hike for quite a few months now, building up to a big adventure. In their context, they've been doing some strength training, some cardio, building up some sort of specific hiking training. And they said, look, just on the weekend, I recently went on a training hike and things just felt really tough. And it felt way tougher than usual. And now I'm a little bit worried about my trip coming up. What should I do? And the issue here is, this is a really, really common thing for a lot of hikers to fall into. Everyone at some stage will have a bad hike. And in a normal situation, this is absolutely fine. It's not that big a deal. We sort of just deal with it. We pick ourselves up, we get back out on the trail, and it's kind of okay. But when we fall into the situation when we're actively training for a trip and we've been sort of leading up to a particular end date, and over time, we've been building up our training, we've been building up our hiking and slowly building things up and continually making things harder. Sometimes when we get to this situation and we step out on the trail and things just feel way harder than it needs to be, this can be really, really stressful. Because number one, it can start making us really worried and anxious, thinking, oh my gosh, this was a training hike and I'm nowhere near where I need to be for my actual trip. How am I going to get ready for this? And on number two, it can actually start us making us doubt all the training we've been putting in. We can start thinking, all right, I've done all this strength training, I've done all this cardio, I've done all this hiking, and I'm still nowhere near I need to be. Like, what's the point? And I've seen a lot of hikers in this situation where they're just completely fallen off the wagon. They've had a good 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks of training, then they have one bad hike and they completely fall off. And we definitely don't want that. Now, the tricky thing in this particular type of situation is there are just so many different factors which can contribute to this. Sometimes we can have a bad hike and there's something just really obvious. We know exactly why this has caused things, and we can identify that. Sometimes we go on a hike and we're just like, oh my gosh, I just don't know what caused it. So a lot of the factors that can contribute to a bad hike are just not so obvious unless we actually really have a think about it. And sometimes, even if you do everything totally right and absolutely perfect, sometimes you can just have a bad day. The human body, the human mind is a funny old thing. And sometimes we can have do every single thing correctly and right, and sometimes we just end up having a bad day, which isn't great. But either way, when it comes down to this type of thing, getting some insights into what may have contributed to this type of thing can go a long, long way. So what I typically recommend, and definitely recommend for anyone in this situation, is basically sitting down, going through a little bit of a process. And what I strongly, strongly recommend is when the memory of this is fresh, when you have just done this type of hike, when you've just gone through this experience, I strongly recommend doing post-hike review, where you can sit down and really think about what issues may contribute to things while it's fresh in your mind. So not trying to do this a week or two after, but literally the day or two after, or whatever it may be. And if we can do a proper review of this and really, really think things through, We can identify things, we can action plan things, and that will not only help us mentally feeling like, okay, I know what went wrong, I know what to do next time, but also physically, so you don't fall into this situation in the future. Now, what I used to do, like we fall into this, we see a lot of this with our clients through Summit Strength and a lot of the people we work with. And one issue we used to run into was like we would sort of have someone who went out on a hike. They'd have a bad adventure. They wasn't exactly sure what caused it. So we'd ask them, hey, did you do this? And they'd say yes or no. And then we'd be like, did you do this? And they'd say yes or no. Or did you do this? And we're trying to play some detective work to kind of figure out what may contribute to that. And the tricky thing with that is it just ended up taking kind of all week, a lot of back and forth, and sometimes it just took a lot of time. So what we started doing recently, which I think can be really, really useful, and I'm going to share with you now, is doing what we call a post-hike review form. And it covers a bunch of different questions, which can often help identify things. Now, anyone watching this right now, the screen is about to go a little bit white, so just bear with me here. But basically coming into this. And this is our post-hike review survey, which we basically get our hikers to do if they've had a bad experience. So essentially what it covers, and is really, really useful, it can basically just sit down and get all the information you need to really self-figure out if your hike was good or not. It covers distance, length in regards to like length and hours, covers how heavy your pack was. It asks what was your terrain like, whether it was easy, difficult, but more difficult than you expected. Asks what the weather was like, whether it was hotter or colder than you expected. How often did you snack? What were your snacks made up of? What was your hydration made up of? Did you have electrolytes? When did you last eat before you hike? How much of the hike did you stick to like nose breathing pace or conversational pace? What was your pacing like? How often did you rest? Was anyone on the hike carrying a pack similar to you, whether it's lighter, the same, or whatever it may be? How did you sleep the night before? Did you train the day before? And what was your mindset? Now, this may seem like a lot if you're looking at this, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of information. But what we can see, if we just plug all of this in, it makes it very, very easy to identify issues when they first creep up and identify issues that may have gone on or may not have been first made a lot of sense initially. So, for example, if we can sort of like go here and you're like, oh, how was the weather? And you're like, actually, it was hotter than I expected. I was comfortable. Well, then we can say, you know what? Actually, hot weather does affect our physical condition and physical capabilities. So we can action plan around ideas to get on top of that. Or we can look at the snacking and we're like, hey, how often did you snack? If someone was like, I snack every 1 to 2 hours, we can say, you know what? That probably is enough. We probably don't need to do that. But if someone was only snacking once every 3 hours or when they were hungry or they felt like it, maybe they were under fueling. Same thing with what were your snacks made up of. If you were just having mainly protein and fat snacks, maybe you want to have a bit more emphasis on carbohydrates. And you can go through all of this and sort of really, really figure things out for yourself and identify what may have been an issue and what sort of carried on there. Now, what I would recommend for anyone watching this is maybe just copy this down and literally just copy these questions down and keep this in your back pocket for if you do have a bad hike and have all of this and just sit down for yourself and figure things out. It can really, really go a long way. One thing I will try and pull up, post hike review. I did an example of this earlier this morning, so bear with me while I pull this up. And I'll give you an actionable example of how this all looks like. Here we go. Post hike review, pull this over. And yeah, let's have a look at this. Why isn't this popping up? There we go. Cool. So this is an example that we had of one of our clients who'd done this in the past. And I'll kind of identify like how I would typically go through it. So in their situation, they'd gone out on, I think, a 16-kilometer hike. It'd taken about 5 hours. They were with a 4-kilo pack. It was a difficult hike, but they expected it. It was a little bit hotter than they expected. They didn't snack. They drank water. They didn't have any electrolytes. Their last full meal was a night before. They didn't really stick to nose breathing pace. They went at their own natural pace, which is kind of okay. They had plenty of rest. They hiked solo. They didn't get a huge amount of sleep the previous night. So when we're going through this, we can actually see, all right, there are definitely some ideas around what may be an issue. Number one, we've got our snacking. That's something we can highlight and say, hey, that's going on. Electrolytes, that's another issue. We can sort of identify this. We can sort of look at this and sort of say, hey, there's no food in the stomach. And we can sort of say, I think there's one more, the sleep. And then all of a sudden, it's gone from, okay, this hike was something that thought I was really prepared for. I thought I was in a really good position. And I went out and all of a sudden it was terrible. I'm feeling really bad about myself. And all of a sudden we've actually got 4 different areas we could look at which could make a dramatic difference to this. So then we can kind of go down and do some action planning. Well, I didn't write it down, but what we would sort of say is like, okay, snacking. If you're hiking for 5 hours or just under 6 hours, you definitely want to be snacking. Typically, for hikers, we usually recommend trying to have a snack of some type, a bite or two every hour or so, so you are regularly replenishing things. Same thing with electrolytes. For any hike over 2 hours, you're probably going to get some benefits from having some electrolyte supplementation, even more so if it is hot, and especially if it's hot. Last full meal before hiking. Typically, I fully understand a lot of hikers struggle to eat in the morning, but if you haven't had any food in your stomach and then you're not snacking, that's probably another reason, another thing saying, hey, the fuel was a little bit low. And then if the sleep wasn't so good, then we can look into potential things of what affected there. So the reason I'm going through this is just to give you sort of an idea. When we're looking at an unsuccessful hike, sometimes it can be really, really obvious why things are going wrong. Sometimes it's not quite as obvious. So doing this type of post-hike review, really being clear about all of these different things that went on, really identifying what's happening on, and putting an action plan into place, it can really, really help us on the mental side of things and help pick us up and make sure we know what we're focusing on, and also can be really, really help us on the physical side as well, and just make sure we're feeling more comfortable in the future. So if you ever do fall into a bit of an unsuccessful hike, feel free to, I would strongly recommend going through that. Probably will make a bit of a difference. So that's my first question that has gone through. And basically, hopefully that helps a few people. Now, if anyone has any particular questions of that, or any questions they did want covered today, feel free to post them up in the chat, and we can go through everything. While we're here, I'm just going to try and play around. Doesn't look like the stream's working in the group, which is a little bit annoying. But let's see if we can get that fixed while we're here. Well, either way, if it's not working, we will just keep on moving forward. So that's the first question. Next question we are going to cover is reviewing an unsuccessful hike, the connection between the foot and the hip. So this is a subject that's probably come up maybe 3 or 4 times in the last month, and it's definitely something I want to cover. It kind of seems like it's a hot topic in the world of training for hiking. Training for hiking always goes through, what do you call it? Trends. And there's always certain trends where someone puts out ideas about something, other people see it, they're like, oh, I like the sound of that. I'm going to start putting ideas around it. And all of a sudden, there's like 20 people talking about the same thing. And this is kind of a recent trend that a lot of people are talking about. And basically, the question that's sort of like, the general question is, I've been hearing people recommend about working on the hip and the foot connection for hikers. Is this important? Can you share your thoughts on this? Can you just explain what it is and what's going on? So basically, when it comes down to this, when we're hiking, we are using the whole body. The hiking pretty much uses the whole body. The legs, the lower legs, the abdominals, the upper body, all of it. It's pretty obvious, the body is working as a whole. And essentially, when it comes down to actual movement, the body as itself, it's never like isolated. It's never just one area movement or one segment of the body moving. It always works as a whole. Now, when it comes down to it, as a really, really, really generalized statement, if all of the joints in the body are moving in the way that they want, and I'm going to say correctly, but correctly in quotation marks because it's a little bit of a rabbit hole there. But if the joints are moving in the way it wants, then the body will probably move happily. Now, there is a lot of debate, a lot of argument around what is correct, and a lot of coaches and a lot of health professionals sometimes make people really, really scared about these types of things and sort of say, hey, your body's not moving right, so we have to do X, Y, and Z and this and that. It's not quite as serious as that. But as a general statement, if the body is moving the way it wants to, the body will be happy. Alternatively, if some joints in the body are moving incorrectly, or maybe they're just moving in ways which aren't as good as they could be, then this can not only affect that particular joint, but it can also have consequences further up or further down the chain. So what I mean by this, to give you an example, is the back, the lower back. So essentially, the lower back as itself is a joint. Now, the areas above and below the lower back is the mid back and the hip. Essentially, if the mid back and the hips are moving in the way that the body likes, if they're moving in a way that's happy, which is comfortable, which is all of that, the lower back tends to be pretty happy. Alternatively, if the mid back isn't moving in the way that we want, or if the hips are not moving in the way that we want, sometimes there can be consequences in the lower back, and that can lead to some issues. As a general rule of thumb, if there's an issue somewhere, it'll typically affect up and down the chain. Now, recently in the world of training for hiking, many people in the hiking space have been talking about this hip and foot connection. So where this sort of comes from is knee pain. Knee pain is such a common thing in the world of training for hiking, in the world of hiking. So many hikers struggle with knee pain. Now, one of the contributing factors when it comes down to knee pain when hiking, it's not the only thing, it's not the main thing, but it is can be a contributing factor, is essentially when the knee will regularly fall inwards. So what I mean by that is basically when we're stepping up and down hills, ideally what we want is the knee's relatively stable. The knee doesn't want to fall in, doesn't want to have a massive bow out, it's relatively stable. One thing that can happen is in certain situations, we can take step and step and step. What will happen is the knee will just buckle in slightly. For some people, it'll just be a tiny little thing. For some people, it'll be very visual and you can actually see it kind of go in and out. And that tends to happen. Now, if this just happens here and there, if this happens in everyday life when you're just standing up off a chair or whatever it may be, it's usually not a big deal. A lot of people have it. It's not really that a big deal. But in the hiking context, the tricky thing here is if you're basically doing this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times of stepping up or down descents and the knees going inwards, this can often be a contributor to pain. Now, when it comes down to this knee buckling in, we don't ideally want that all the time. One reason that this can happen, it's not the only reason, but one reason is the knee can fall in is if we don't actually have enough strength in what we call the hip abductors. So essentially muscles in the glutes, which are responsible for pulling the hip out and pulling the knee out. If the muscle in the glute is not quite as strong as it needs to be, that can sometimes lead to that knee falling in because that muscle can't support the hip in the way it wants, which will have consequences down at the knee. Another thing that can sometimes lead to this is basically the knee can fall in is if the arches, so the feet themselves, aren't quite as stable as we want. And essentially what can happen is if the arches, instead of being nice and stable, if they can completely collapse in, this can lead the knee up a little bit further to buckle in. So if the hip and the feet are falling in, the knee will fall in. Pretty straightforward. Now, this happens to a lot of people. And before I go any further, I just want to say this is a really common thing. A lot of people will freak out about this and they'll see it and they'll notice it happen and they'll absolutely just get obsessive about it. It is not the only thing that causes pain. It's not automatically going to cause pain if it happens, if you're doing this, but it can be something worthwhile getting to. I want to make that clear because a lot of people, when they dive into this type of stuff, they just get a little bit alarmist about it all. And I don't want to be like that today. Now, coming down, as a general statement, if we're aware that, okay, if the muscles in the hip are not strong enough, and that can lead to a little bit of inward knee collapse. And if the muscles in the feet are falling in and they're not supporting you and they're falling in, and that can lead to a little bit of inward knee collapse. To keep the knees happy, it makes sense to do a little bit of training to help support the hip and the feet and help them stay stable, help them stay comfortable so that knee doesn't fall. Pretty straightforward. Now, a couple of notes before I go any further. While this whole knee collapse may be a factor, a contributing factor for the knee pain, it's definitely not the only factor. And it's definitely not the major factor for a lot of people. Also, on top of this, while working on areas which can help this issue, and we're going to talk through a few different things, there are definitely plenty of other things you can do which can actually help reduce this type of collapse, which I'm going to dive into, which beyond what we're talking about today. So, for example, realistically, we haven't talked about the quadriceps front of the thighs. If they are weak, if they're tired, if they're fatigued and you're going up steep steps, one of the compensations of the body's like, hey, I'm not actually strong enough to get up with my quads, so I'll do a little buckle to give me a little bit extra force. That is a way the body compensates to actually push us up. So one way you can attack this is if you have more quadriceps strength, it'll help you get up those steps a little bit easier, which will make sure the knees don't knock in quite as much. So there's a lot of things that goes into it, just to be clear. Now, coming down, let's talk about this, the knee to foot connection, because a lot of coaches in the hiking world, and what is popping up more and more, you see on Instagram or Facebook and this and that, coaches are sort of talking about specific exercises which will hone on this particular thing. And they'll demonstrate an exercise and they'll say, hey, this particular exercise is going to teach you activate your glutes and help the hip and the knee connection. And when it comes down to it, there's nothing wrong with that approach. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that's like incorrect or anything like that. But the tricky thing with this is sometimes if we're like, hey, I want to really, really hone in with specific exercises which are just going to hone in on this particular area. Sometimes it can end up just being a bit of a rabbit hole. Sometimes it can end up being a little bit of time suck. And sometimes we can just end up spending a huge amount of time on this and then kind of missing out on other areas of our training, which is what we don't want. I'm not saying you always will fall into that, but it can happen. So if you are thinking about this whole situation, you're like, I'm a hiker, I want to minimize that inward knee knock. This is kind of what I typically do with my hikers and the process that I sort of follow with my clients. Now, at a level one, so this is the majority of hikers out there, even people who don't have knee pain, even people who don't have this issue, this is kind of what I do for the majority of people. Number one, for pretty much all my hikers, I will do a little bit of isolation work on those hip abductors, on those of that glute medius, and I will do some exercises which will specifically work this particular area. So to give you examples of this, is like mini band walks, monster walks, clams, this type of stuff that you kind of seen, if you go into a physio or physical therapist or whatever it may be. To give you an idea of this, let me type mini band. Just to give you an idea of this, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, these mini band walks where you got like a knee band around your feet, going side to side, you're working that outward hips there. So very, very simple. I'll typically get most of my hikers doing that. I typically use these in our strength warm-ups. I think it's just a nice way to warm up for strength workouts, and I get pretty much all my hikers working on that. Now, on top of that, what I will also get most of my hikers doing is doing some compound exercises, things like step downs and single leg deadlifts, exercises which are working multiple muscle groups. It will work a little bit on this glute medius, but also multiple muscle groups. And essentially what we will do here is just make sure we have the cue, making sure the knees don't fall in. So to give you an example on the step down, you've probably seen this video a million times if you followed my stuff. One of the things I talk about is basically step down being a great exercise for this. And when we're doing the step down, one of the key things to this is as we're coming down, we're just not making sure the knee doesn't fall in. We're keeping it nice and steady, keeping it here and coming up and down. Same thing for a single leg deadlift. Again, this is one of my favorite exercises for hikers, tipping over in the other direction. Can't really see it in this video, but one of the cues we want is just making sure that knee doesn't fall in. Now, this is typically what I'll get most of my hikers doing, just for general strengthening. And realistically, for the majority of hikers out there, if you do a little bit of this, and if you make sure you concentrate on your knees not falling in with exercises like this will work this whole knee to hip connection, foot to hip connection enough. This can be really effective without only doing any more specific exercises, but it works really, really well. This is probably what 95% of my hikers are doing in this type of situation. Then we can go up to level two. And level two is kind of hikers who are like, okay, I've actually identified that, or we have identified, I'm not saying I'm saying the hiker has identified that this is actually something I struggle with a little bit. So it may be a case of, look, I get knee pain, I'm aware of it, and also I'm aware that, hey, my knee does knock in quite a bit, or someone's seen this in person. So then we go up in a level. We get a little bit more specific and put a couple more cues here. So first of all, we'll do pretty much the same stuff. We'll still do the same isolation. You'll still get some good benefits here. We'll still do these same compound exercises with the step downs and the single-legged deadlifts. And in this situation, if someone does struggle, then we'll put a little bit more attention into the feet. And what we'll sort of say is, okay, we actually really, really want to pay attention here. And what we'll get them to do is these compound exercises, and we'll get them to do them without shoes. So what I mean by that is basically, if you haven't got so many issues, you can do these exercises, shoes, barefoot, whatever it may be. If you are struggling with this, one thing that can be useful is doing these types of exercises barefoot. Because as we sort of said before, what we're trying to prevent is that knee knocking in, which can come from the hips or from those arches collapsing. So actually practicing this with bare feet and making sure the feet don't fall in and keeping those feet stable, that will help strengthen up the feet muscles a little bit. That will help you feel a bit more stable, and that will naturally help without too much variation, too much messing around. So you can probably see here, it might be a little bit small, but if you zoomed in, you can actually see my feet doing these ones, and it can be quite difficult. And essentially what you want to do is just make sure your feet are steady. You've got some pressure through the front of the foot, the side of the foot, and the heel, and you're just making sure your feet don't collapse inwards as you're going through. So you're going through the checklist in your head as we come down, knees not falling in, feet aren't falling in, everything's nice and steady. Similar thing for the single-legged deadlift. So you could do the same thing with your feet, with your bare foot. So again, your feet will be doing this. You want to keep it nice and steady, weight on the front, the side, and the back of the feet, and keep that strong. Now, that in itself, for a lot of hikers out there, that will be enough to kind of help build up strength there. That will be enough to help build up that hip to foot connection. That will be enough to help support your knees. And I really like that because it doesn't end up adding extra exercises. It doesn't end up throwing away, spending a huge amount of time. It can be really useful. And the only extra cue here will just sort of say when you're doing your hiking, when you're doing your stair or hill sessions, just every once in a while, just check in with yourself and just ask yourself, what's my knee doing? When I'm going up a hill, have a look down at the knees. Is my knee doing big inwards falling in? If so, maybe just put a bit more attention to keep it a bit steadier. And just cue yourself to check in every once in a while and just correct it where you can. So, as I sort of said, level one, that's probably 95% of hikers. This level two will probably be like 4% of hikers who struggle with this. And if there is like someone who has been doing this and they really, really do struggle, then we go up to a level three. And this is probably like 1% of hikers I work with. They'll basically do the same thing in regards to that. And then what we'll do is just introduce some specific foot drills. For me personally, I don't do a huge amount of like specific foot training with my hikers. Like it can be beneficial. I see a lot of hikers like go into this, but I feel like, it can sometimes just be a bit of a time suck. But, sometimes I will apply this. So when I'm talking about specific foot drills, it might be something as simple as this, where basically, again, your bare feet. What we're doing in this specific thing, we're rolling out on the sides of our legs, pulling our big toes up off the floor, rolling out on the sides. So what we're doing here is just making sure those arches don't collapse. We're being a little bit more intentional, pushing the feet out and putting a bit of pressure there. Then essentially what we would do is just do little steps, keeping everything like that, stepping forward, stepping back. Now, the idea behind this isn't how we naturally walk, obviously. And I'm not recommending you do this when you're actually hiking. But this overemphasis into this type of thing can just be an easy way just to strengthen up some of those foot muscles, help you feel a little bit more stable, and just add this in. Very, very simple, but it can go a long way. And essentially, when it comes down to this, I quite like this approach because obviously I use it. But I like this approach because, level one, level two, when you're looking at this, it won't end up adding any extra time or effort into a normal training plan. Because all of these things, the isolation for the hips, the compound exercises, being aware, even doing things with the shoes, all of this is going to have a lot of crossover into many, many other aspects of your hiking. And if you came to me and said, hey, I'm doing this as just a general training for hiking plan. I don't even care about my feet. I don't even care about my hips. I don't even care about my knees. I'm just doing this to get stronger. That works out really well. So this can be a really, really good way to kind of just filter things in and just put a bit more intention into helping you through this. And then if you end up level three, it's only realistically only a few extra minutes to do those type of foot drills. Or I often get people just doing this in their rest periods or their warm-ups of training. So I know that was a big, big, big ramble on this particular subject, but I do see this coming up quite a bit, and a lot of people have asked me. This whole hip to foot thing, it is important, but it is a bit of a trend in the world of training for hiking at the moment. A lot of people are talking about it. You can train in many, many different ways. Yes, you can do the specific exercises for this stuff. It does work, but you can also train this type of stuff even with your normal exercises either way. So with that being said, if anyone is watching this, if you did have any questions you want to cover today on this live Q&A, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm more than happy to cover any topic you want while we're here. And yeah, let me see. Did I have another? I think I already covered this one. I think those were the main questions that I wanted to cover today. So yeah, as I said, if anyone does have any questions who's watching live, feel free to plug them up, put them up. In the meantime, while we're waiting, I've sent the questions I've sent through already. We're going to go into a little bit of course creation now, where we're basically just going to be doing a little bit of live course creation. Now, if you haven't seen this basically before, this is the course I'm putting together on these streams is basically a course on respiratory muscle training for hiking, which is essentially strength training for your breathing muscles. In the world of training for hiking, a lot of people talk about breathing training in many ways, shapes, and forms. A lot of people talk about doing these techniques, this and that. Realistically, for a lot of breathing training, there is a big question mark in regards to the effectiveness of a lot of methods a lot of people talk about. And I don't often talk about specific breathing techniques because aside from the basics, I feel like there's just a lot of question marks around the effectiveness of certain things. And even though a lot of people say, hey, these things will improve X, Y, and Z, if you actually look into it, sometimes it's a bit debatable. But when it comes down to the more advanced breathing techniques, this respiratory muscle training, I believe that there is a lot of promising evidence to show this could be a potential really cool thing for hikers to look into, or some hikers to look into. It's not something everyone needs to look into, but it can be pretty useful. So essentially what I'm doing on these streams in between questions is basically just doing a bit of live course creation. So I'm just putting this together as I work through things. And yeah, so you can get a little bit of inside look in regards to how I go about things. So realistically, um, the way we sort of work on all this is I'm a little bit scattershot in regards to how I do my courses. Typically, I'll just kind of put bits and pieces down as I work through things, and I'll be like, hey, this topic, this topic, this topic, this topic. And then I'll kind of step back and be like, okay, does this make logical sense? Do we need to fill in a gap here? Do we need to clean this up or whatever it may be? And slowly work through things. So it is a little bit of all over the shop at the moment. But essentially, what I am going to be covering today is just getting into a little bit about the training protocols we want for this. Because we talked about in the last stream around about, that foundational breathing strategies around diaphragmatic breathing and making sure we're getting that right. And then we talked about just getting used to the resistance with this type of thing, which can take a little bit of getting used to. And essentially now we just want to sort of talk about training protocols. So let me have a think. How do we want to sort of say this? The design. And also, while I'm typing along with this and as I'm going through, if anyone does have any questions they want covered, just plug it in the chat and I'll go through anything you want in regards to Q&A. All right. So to start with, yeah, basics, to get the desired result benefits of respiratory muscle training, we want to be making sure we're applying the right training protocols. Because as we said in previous streams, if we don't apply the required resistance, it's probably going to lead to non-effective results. When we're loading up these breathing muscles, we need a device like this where we actually load up the muscles. Even though you can apply small amounts of load with these breathing devices, and there's a bunch of different stuff, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that, okay, if we apply a small amount of resistance, which feels like we're working, and we train that over time, unless we apply enough resistance, it won't actually give us the desired results. So it may feel like it's working, but it probably isn't giving us what we want. On top of that, if we don't use the desired technique, this can also lead to non-effective results. And if we don't train over the required timeline, this can lead to non-effective results as well. So let's sort of talk about technique to start. We want to make sure So first and foremost, we want to make sure we're still sticking with that diaphragmatic breathing. So we're still making sure we're breathing into the belly, feeling that movement. So we are working the diaphragm and building up strength with that. Number two, we want to make sure that we are, how do I phrase this? Training the breathing muscles through the full range of motion. Sure. So number two, we want to make sure, okay, we are training the breathing muscles for the full range of motion. One thing that can be very, very easy when you're using these things, and I know I do it if I don't pay attention, is sometimes we can ramp up the resistance, maybe a little bit too much, and we end up basically just not getting a full breath in or not getting a full exhale. We end up just sort of training a three-quarter or half range of motion, which similar to strength training, when we're just working out normal muscles, this type of stuff, it can still be beneficial for strength. It can still develop a bit of strength. It can be useful, but it's going to miss some key areas. So we want to make sure we're doing that. We want to make sure we are training the breath using the right velocity. Quick and of course Inhales. Um, let's sort of say, so I'll probably have to word that a little bit differently when I put it together. But essentially, when we're looking at this sort of breathing training, one thing we do want to be making sure is we are using forceful breaths. So essentially, what we're doing is when we're breathing in with this respiratory device, is we're doing a breath where we're like really, really, really strong. And we're being quite forceful. The idea behind this is if you are just doing slow breathing and you're just doing very, very slow inhales, yes, you can apply a lot of resistance. Yes, you can apply, quite a bit of weight to it. But when it comes down to our muscle fibers, whether it's our muscles or our breathing muscles, whatever it may be, there are different muscle fibers. Some respond to slower movements, some respond to quicker movements. As a really massive generalization, the slow breathing will basically work the ones that respond to slower movements, but won't really do so much for the ones that want fast movements. On the flip side of things, the ones that, if we're doing quicker breathing, it will actually do both. It'll get a good spread of everything. So we want to make sure it's powerful and forceful in regards to the breathing in. And I'll probably have to reword that and explain a little bit more technically. As I'm working through this, by the way, if anyone does have any questions, not even on this breathing stuff, but anything in regards to training for hiking, fire away. I'm happy, happy, happy to have a chat about anything. Right, velocity. We need to make sure we don't. So one thing we need to be aware of here is if you are using this resistance on this type of stuff and you're loading it up again a bit stronger, we just need to make sure that yeah, we're not going too heavy and we're not loading up so heavy that we can only really do that slow breathing. And we'll have to talk through that in a future stream about how we're going to go about things. So right. So let's sort of think this through. I'm going to turn this into numbers. No, I can't. One. Yeah, so that's the next one. Again, I'll have to reword this as we go through, but number three, rapidly and forcefully exhale against the resistance. So we want to concentrate on bringing the belly expanding. We want to make sure that the stomach and the rib cage and the muscles in our neck, we can actually feel that all contracting as we're breathing the air in and getting some resistance on those things. And then while we're doing this, we want to try our best to relax the upper chest and the shoulders. So we're not doing massive things like this, where we're just like up and down, but that's relatively relaxed. There may be a little bit of tension in here, but we're breathing into the diaphragm, feeling tension coming throughout. Then we'll have to talk about exhale, 5, slight pause, repeat, and I'll break those down. Technique. So then we can talk about training protocol. Um, So I'll probably have to break this all down a little bit more. In all honesty, I'm kind of losing my voice today. I've been on a call all day, so I'm going to have to wrap up this stream a little bit earlier. But what we're going to break down in the next one is we'll break down this technique step by step walkthrough a little bit more, and I'll put together some videos on this for next time for when we actually do the course. Realistically, for this type of thing, one of the big reasons why I like this is the training protocol itself. It's very, very short. It's very, very condensed. And essentially what we're looking at doing is we're doing 30 breaths leading to fatigue. So similar to like if you're doing strength training, you're doing a bunch of repetitions and eventually you get to the end of your set where there would be fatigue and like I can't really do anymore. This one, what we're looking at is a set of 30 inhales. So breathing in, that forceful 30, exhale. Do that 30 times, get into the point where we get a bit of fatigue. So it does take a bit of playing around to get the right resistance to do that. And we'll talk through a bit of a walkthrough on how to go about that. And then we'll talk through about how to go progression over time. And then realistically, what we want to do here, 30 breaths in the morning, 30 breaths in the evening, 6 days a week. So we're not doing this every single day, but 6 days a week. So that's literally only 6 minutes a day for 6 days a week. So that's like 36 minutes a week for some really potentially cool results. And essentially for the timeline, 6 weeks before a trip is ideally what we want to do. And then we'll talk through one thing. I've got reversibility. How long before results go backwards? So we'll have to break that down as well a little bit. With that being said, probably what I'm going to do, I might wrap up this stream because my voice is just about to go and I've got a few more calls. So we got through 45 minutes today, which is pretty decent. But basically, anyone watching this in the future, if anyone does have any questions about this, about training for hiking, about this course we're going through, or anything like that, feel free to send them over to me. I'm happy to cover these. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm always happy to help. But aside from that, for anyone watching in the future or anyone here live, I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you got a little bit out of it. And we'll talk to you very, very soon.